This idea of the Messiah having to die or fail and come back later, this is a claim that could be made for any failed or false Messiah. Anyone that claims to be the Messiah and fails to fulfill what the Messiah is supposed to do, the followers can always say, well, but he'll come back and finish the job, or he'll come back and do the job. You could say that about anyone. And so it's not really a strong argument, because it's really sort of what we call the fudge factor, that any false Messiah can justify their failure by claiming that they'll come back and finish the job or fulfill the mission.
Welcome to TaNaCh Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Welcome back, Rabbi, for Luke chapter 21. How are you doing this morning?
Thank God, Baruch Hashem.
Amen.
Doing well.
Very nice, very nice.
And good to be back here with you.
Thank you, and it's good to have you back with me and me to be with you as
I always like it when I can be here 2 weeks in a row.
Well, with your crazy schedule, I'm glad you're able to pull that off. That's good. So we'll take as much as we can get, so without holding your feet to the fire. So, but yeah, so that's good. So this is the never-ending question, of course, for all humanity: is when is Jesus coming back? I say coming is all you.
I think he's late.
I think he's way late. After he told his disciples, anyway, right?
Yeah, but that's going to be a big focus of Luke 21. Jesus starts to get into stargazing and forecasting and what's going to be, as we say. But the chapter gets off to a slow start, and it's actually another teaching that Jesus gets right, actually. And so the chapter begins where Jesus is in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, and it says that he saw the rich people, some rich people putting their gifts into the temple treasury. And then he also saw a poor widow putting in 2 very small coins, like 2 pennies. And Jesus remarks, "Truly I say to you, that this poor widow put in more than all of them. All of them together, she put in much more than them. For they all, out of their surplus, put into the offering." Meaning they had plenty, and they were just, it's like if a millionaire gives you $5, big deal. But she, out of her poverty, put in all that she had to live on, meaning she really sacrificed to give. So that's what Jesus basically says. She praises this woman and her gift, which was very, very, very tiny. It was minuscule, but he praises it more than the more elaborate gifts of the wealthy. Now, again, this is something that Jesus gets right. He's speaking about true giving. And, there's an old expression that many people have said, that there are many new and wonderful things in the Christian Bible. But you have to realize that whatever is new is not wonderful, and whatever is wonderful is not new. So the truth is that the Pharisaic sages have taught basically the exact same thing many, many places. I mean, I'm not going to go through all of them. There are dozens and dozens and dozens, but I'll just mention a few of the teachings of the sages from the rabbinic sages, the Pharisaic sages, who basically taught the same thing. So there's a Mishnah, which is one of the earliest rabbinic teachings, and it says it doesn't matter whether your offering be much or little, so long as your heart is directed to heaven. Meaning what's important is your intention. What's important is your heart and not the size of your gift. And then there are several midrashim So there are various collections of midrashim, which are rabbinic parables and teachings. So one is from Leviticus, Rabbah, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 3, paragraph 5, which says, there is a story of a woman who brought a handful of meal, meaning grain, flour. She brought a handful of meal as an offering, and there was a priest who despised it and said, see what they offer. He's saying, look what they bring. She's bringing a handful of flour. What's the big deal? But it was shown to him in a dream, the Midrash says, do not despise her, because it is as if she sacrificed herself as the sacrifice. When she brought this flour, this very simple offering, it's as if she sacrificed herself. Now, why does the Midrash say that it's as if she sacrificed herself? So there's another Midrash called the Yalkut Shimoni, to Leviticus, to the book of Vayikra, which points out that when the Torah describes the meal offering, the simplest kind of offering, the Torah uses the term nefesh, or soul. Usually when the Torah describes someone bringing a sacrifice, the Torah will say Adam, a person, when a person brings a sacrifice. But when it comes to the meal offering, which you see, for example, in, I believe, chapter 2, verse 1 of Leviticus, so when it speaks about the meal offering, it doesn't say Adam ki yakriv, when a man brings such an offering. It says nefesh, when a person's very soul brings this offering. So the Midrash says, because who is the one? The Midrash asks, who is the one that brings a meal offering? So the Midrash says, the poor do. This is the offering of a poor person. So God says, I reckon it as if he has offered his very soul before me. That's why the Torah uses the word nefesh, soul, when it comes to the one who brings a meal offering. And then there's another Midrash to Ecclesiastes, to Koheles, chapter 4, paragraph 6, which says, God prefers one handful of a free will offering of the poor to the heap of incense which is offered by the high priest. So just a handful of a free will offering of the poor, which we saw was a meal offering. So that is preferred by God to the heaping offering of incense. Incense was very expensive. So again, the sages are basically teaching something very similar to what Jesus taught, which is that when a person gives sacrificially, when they give beyond their means, when it hurts for them to give, they don't have, and they give anyway, that's what's ultimately valued and respected by the Almighty. So moving on now, it says that some of the people around Jesus, they were speaking about the Holy Temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones. And Jesus said, as for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another which will not be torn down. So Jesus here is speaking about the destruction of this temple in Jerusalem. Now, just make a few observations here. First of all, the Gospel of Luke was written around 20 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the Second Temple. So this is obviously a very easy prediction to put into the mouth of Jesus. Again, we have to remember that Jesus didn't write the book of Luke in real time. He didn't write these words when he was alive and dying on the crucifixion stake about 40 years before the temple is destroyed. He didn't actually write any prediction. This is, again, the gospel writer telling you what Jesus said. We don't know for sure what Jesus said. Now, is it possible Jesus said such a thing? We'll discuss that in a moment. But just to realize that the writer of Luke is writing around the year 90 of the Common Era. So it's about 20 years after the destruction of the temple. So when the gospel writer here is putting together his biography of Jesus, this is sort of a no-brainer kind of prophecy to stick into the mouth of Jesus. It already happened 20 years prior. But the truth is that the rabbinic sages already knew decades before the destruction of the temple that the sins of the people were going to bring it about. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't, a surprise to the rabbinic leaders, to the sages of Israel in the year 70 when the temple was destroyed. My father, of blessed memory, told me when he was growing up in Poland, before the Holocaust, he said that the rabbis that he studied with when he was in school, they already spoke about the coming of the Holocaust. People knew it was coming. It wasn't a mystery. It wasn't a secret. So the fact is that here Luke is writing 20 years after the fact and speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem. But the truth is that the sages, the Pharisaic sages, the rabbinic sages, decades before the destruction already were predicting it. They were writing about it. They were preaching about it because they knew that the people were living very, very despicable lives, as the Talmud says, even though on the surface they seem to be religious Jews, but their relationships with each other were very, very rotten. There was slander, there was evil speech, there were people that just weren't getting along properly. People didn't respect each other. And so the Talmud says that that was the main cause of the destruction of Jerusalem. And the truth is that for those who understood the book of Daniel, Daniel already predicted the destruction of Jerusalem around the year 70 of the Common Era anyway. So had Jesus started speaking about the fact that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, again, that was already written about in the TaNaCh hundreds of years earlier. Now, in verses 7 to 8, his disciples ask him, when will these things happen? Now, this is going to be a big problem for us in this chapter because we're going to see that it's not clear if this chapter is focusing on the immediate future or the future in the distant future. So it sounds like, Jesus is speaking here about the destruction of the temple, and the disciples ask, when will these things happen? What sign will there be that these things are about to take place? So Jesus says, don't be misled, for many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the time is at hand, but do not go after them. So before actually answering their question, he doesn't answer their question here. Jesus warns them that there will be many people who will come claiming to be the Messiah and claiming that the time is at hand. But don't listen to them. That's what Jesus initially says to his disciples. Now, again, this is difficult to understand because if Jesus here is speaking about something that will happen during his lifetime, if that's what he's talking about, he allegedly knew that he'd be dying very soon. I mean, we're in Luke chapter 21. He's about to go to Jerusalem, where he had been telling his disciples that when he gets to Jerusalem, he's going to be killed. So he doesn't have a lot of time left. So he's speaking here about many people coming and claiming to be him, claiming to be the Messiah, and claiming that the time is at hand, which means, apparently, that the time of the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen soon. And Jesus says, listen, ignore these people. Now, it's not clear how much he's saying to ignore. Is he only saying to ignore their claims to being him, to being the Messiah? Or is he saying ignore their claims that these events are at hand, meaning that the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen soon? But if he's referring, Jesus, to things that he assumes will be happening soon, there's not a lot of time for these things to happen. You know, he's only got a matter of weeks left to live. And yet he's talking about many people are going to come claiming to be him. That really doesn't sound like something that he's speaking about happening imminently. It sounds like he's speaking about in the future, and it could be many, many years in the future. So again, this is going to be a confusing element in chapter 21. Is Jesus speaking about things that are supposed to happen soon, or is he pointing to the distant future? Or maybe both. Again, this is something that we have to unravel. And if he's speaking here about something that will happen during his lifetime, so the temple again is going to be destroyed very, very soon. So why would he tell his disciples to ignore anyone that says that these things are about to happen, that these things are at hand? According to Jesus, that's exactly what they should believe, because again, that's what he's saying. So this is one possibility, that Jesus is speaking here about things that he believes will take place somehow in his lifetime. Or maybe he's speaking here about a time after his death. So this is another problem we're going to run into. If he's speaking here long term, that in the distant future, meaning in the coming decades, in the coming hundreds of years, there are going to be people claiming to be him, claiming to be the Messiah. And they are going to say that the destruction of Jerusalem is at hand. And Jesus says, ignore them, don't listen to them. So we're going to see that you have many passages in the Christian Bible which seem to indicate that Jesus is going to actually accomplish everything. Everything is going to be accomplished very soon, meaning that within that generation. And that's going to be a problem. How do you square the fact that, again, if he's speaking here in terms of the distant future, and that even in the distant future, don't assume the temple's going to be destroyed? So how do you square that with all of the passages in the Christian Bible? We'll get into these later on in this program. But you have many, many passages that seem to indicate that everything is going to be fulfilled in that generation, in the lifetime of Jesus. So that's an open question. In verses 9 to 10, Jesus says, when you hear of wars and disturbances, do not be terrified, for these things must take place. First, the end does not follow immediately. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. Now, again, this is difficult, because if he's speaking about these things happening in his lifetime, meaning in the near future, so you're not going to have all of these wars and nations going against nations, all of this happening before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. However, we have this similar teaching in rabbinic sources. In the Midrash to the book of Bereshit, to Genesis chapter 42, not 42 in Genesis, but in the Midrash chapter 42, paragraph 4, the rabbis say, when you see the kingdoms fighting against one another, look and expect the foot of the Messiah, meaning the steps of the Messiah coming. So there is this tradition that prior to the coming of the Messiah, that's in Jewish terms. I guess in Christian terms, you'd have to say prior to the return of the Messiah, there's going to be all these wars and universal conflicts and nations and kingdoms fighting against each other. But again, none of that happened in the first century. So again, it's difficult to squeeze all of these predictions into the first century. And that's, again, one of the problems in this chapter is what in the world is Jesus referring to? Is he referring to the immediate future or the distant future? And again, some might say both. But these predictions that Jesus is making, I mean, they sound in a bit like a horoscope. If you ever read a horoscope, anyone could see themselves in a horoscope. The predictions are so general and non-specific that they're not really that meaningful. So to say that, to tell his disciples that if you want to know, when the end is coming, well, there's going to be wars and conflicts in the world. Well, the truth is there are always wars and conflicts in the world. If you go back 3,000 years and you try to plot how many decades did we live as a planet without wars and conflicts, there were not many. So this is a kind of sign that's not very helpful. It's not very meaningful. Because literally there are always, if you actually do a little research now, there are more wars going on now than you could imagine. We don't read about most of them because they're in other parts of the world. But there are actually many wars taking place in the world right now. So to speak about the fact that one of the signs of the end is going to be the fact that there are wars and conflicts and powers that are going against each other, it's not a very useful sign. In verse 11, Jesus says, "And there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven." So we should realize a few things. That number one, these kinds of descriptions of the end times are already in TaNaCh. The TaNaCh speaks about these kinds of signs that are going to happen in the future, and not just in the TaNaCh, but in Jewish apocalyptic literature. We have a vast literature where Jewish people contemplated the end and the end times and the apocalypse and, the sort of violence that's going to accompany the end times. So these are not unusual statements that Jesus is making. They're very familiar to both the TaNaCh and apocalyptic literature. And again, as I mentioned before, these are not very useful signs to speak about plagues and earthquakes and things like that and famines, because again, they're always happening. They're always taking place. And a third thing just to bear in mind is that when the TaNaCh speaks about these negative things happening, and the TaNaCh has many dire predictions about the future and about terrible wars, we have to remember an important principle, that when the TaNaCh speaks about negative prophecies, about things that are catastrophes and disasters, those kinds of prophecies are always contingent, meaning they don't have to happen. If the people do not wake up, then they will happen to help wake up the people. But if people wake up and return to God before these catastrophes take place, they don't have to happen. And the source for this, again, is in the book of Jonah. In the book of Jonah, the prophet Jonah goes to Nineveh and predicts that the whole city will be overturned in 40 days. But the king of Nineveh got the message and basically led his city into a program of teshuvah, of repentance. And so none of these terrible things happened to the city. They were able to head them off at the pass. So in verse 12, Jesus says, but before these things, they will lay their hands on you. So now he's saying that before these wars and conflicts and famines and earthquakes and plagues, Jesus predicts they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. So again, either Jesus was referring specifically to the immediate future. He's saying to his followers, you guys will be handed over to the synagogues. Or
I can't believe it worked.
He's not speaking
Doing
about
this
the
before
immediate future. He's speaking about the distant future, that somehow in the future Christians will be handed over to the synagogues. And Jesus wasn't aware of the fact that within 300 years, Christianity would be the most powerful institution in the world, and no one is going to be handing over Christians to the synagogues. That prediction about being handed over to the synagogues would only be relevant in the very, very embryonic stages of the church, meaning when it's a tiny, tiny minority within Israel. Then you could think about the idea that perhaps, for whatever reasons, they might be turned over to rabbinic authorities for questioning, for punishment, who knows for what. Because as I've argued, the early church, the early followers of Jesus, did nothing out of the ordinary. They did not reject the Torah. They did not stop observing the Torah. And to believe that someone was the Messiah was not heresy. So there was nothing that any Christian or follower of Jesus in the first century would have to worry about in terms of being in trouble with the rabbinic authorities. As a matter of fact, we see this in Acts chapter 5, when allegedly there's a mob that wants to either kill or beat the hell out of Peter and the disciples, and they go before Rabbi Gamliel, who was the leader of the Pharisaic movement, and he says, look, I don't see anything wrong with these people. Put them, he says, we'll take a wait and see attitude. And he says, look, if this movement is of God, you're not going to be able to stop it. If it's not of God, then it'll fall apart by itself. But he doesn't see anything wrong with them at the moment. So it's very difficult to understand this because, again, in the immediate future, there was no reason to deliver up disciples of Jesus to the synagogues. Nothing would happen. We keep on seeing, after Jesus is executed, Paul is always going into the synagogues and preaching. No one's beating him up. He's not questioned. What are you doing preaching here? And when the disciples go to the temple in the book of Acts, no one's saying, what are you doing in the holy temple? So there was nothing that would precipitate the disciples of Jesus in the immediate situation being handed over to the synagogue. And if you go a little bit further into the future, the synagogue had no power because the church became the main institutional power in the world. As a matter of fact, things worked the other way around. As it turns out, it was usually the Jews that were delivered up to the churches and persecuted by the churches. Also, as it turns out, we're still awaiting verses 9 to 11, meaning that we haven't had all of these wars and nations and kingdoms fighting against each other, again, back in the first century. So it's hard to know what he's referring to when he says that even before these wars and conflicts and famines and plagues and earthquakes, you'll be delivered up to the synagogues. It hadn't happened yet. So there was no precedent for these things to take place. In verses 13 to 15, Jesus reassures his disciples that when they are delivered up to the synagogues, it will lead to an opportunity to share their testimony. And Jesus says you won't have to think in advance. You won't have to prepare what to say, because Jesus will give people what to say, meaning that Jesus will tell people what you should say when you're brought to the synagogues. And no one, Jesus says, is going to be able to refute them. That's the assurance that Jesus gives in verses 13 to 15.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.
That's the assurance that Jesus gives in verses 13 to 15. Now, again, this didn't happen historically. Instead, number one, it was the churches that persecuted the Jews. Again, Jesus here is claiming that the synagogues will persecute the believers. But the historical reality is that it was the churches who persecuted the Jews. And it was the churches that forced us to engage in disputations. There weren't situations where the rabbinic sages would they would haul in the followers of Jesus into the synagogues and ask them all kinds of questions in order to refute them. On the contrary, it were the churches that would force the rabbis into having religious disputations. And it wasn't that Jesus gave the Christians ammunition to be able to befuddle their opponents. On the contrary, it was the rabbis who vanquished the Christians in these religious disputes. For example, if you were to read the Vikuach Haranban, the disputation of Nachmanides that took place in the 13th century, you can actually watch a recreation, not a totally historical, but more or less historical recreation of this debate on YouTube. It's called The Disputation. And that's exactly what happened. That because he was able to win handily this debate, the king of Spain really was impressed with his performance, and he had to flee Spain. He had to end up at the age of 70 approximately, leaving Spain and going to Israel because he was able to vanquish his opponents. In verse 16, Jesus says, "But you will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death." And in verse 17, "And you'll be hated by all on account of my name." That's what Jesus again predicts here, that you'll be hated by all on account of my name. So this is really a distortion of true biblical teaching, because in the Bible, in the TaNaCh, we don't see anything about the Messiah being hated or about the followers of the Messiah being hated by the rest of the Jewish community. What we do see in the TaNaCh is that the nation of Israel will be hated because of their association with God, with Hashem. However, as the Gospels show, Jesus was not hated by all. During his lifetime, for sure, he's followed by adoring crowds all the time, and certainly never after his death is he hated by all. Again, that's the claim that Jesus makes here in verse 17. You'll be hated by all. Well, that never happened in his lifetime. It certainly will never happen after his lifetime. You have 2 billion Christians in the world today. In verses 20 to 22, Jesus says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand." Now, this is not really the most surprising kind of prediction to make. Obviously, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, by enemy armies, well, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to wonder that maybe the end is at hand. And that's what he says. Now, there are 2 possibilities. Actually, I should read. I'm just going to go a little bit further. That was verse 20. So let's just go a little bit further. Jesus says in verse 21, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her." Meaning Jesus is saying that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, its end is near. So he's saying, get out of Dodge. It's a good time to get out of there. And then he says in verse 22, For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." So there are 2 possibilities for the forecasts made by Jesus, or again, more likely put into his mouth by the gospel writers. 2 possibilities. Number 1, again, he is assuming that these things will soon happen. He's assuming that very soon Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by invading armies and the end will be near and you should leave. Or he's speaking about the distant future. Again, there are no other possibilities. These are the only 2 possibilities. So again, as I mentioned, this is not rocket science, because all the signs were already in place. By the time Jesus is speaking, all the signs were already in place that the destruction would soon happen. And it was already foretold in prophecy, or Luke is writing in hindsight. So again, these are the 2 possibilities, that if Jesus is speaking about something that's about to happen, again, if it was actually said by Jesus, it's not anything that's surprising, because both the Bible and the rabbis were saying the exact same thing, that Jerusalem very soon is going to be destroyed. Or Jesus didn't say these things, and Luke, who's writing after the destruction, is putting these words into the mouth of Jesus. However, other parts of Jesus' warnings did not take place then. So again, if you go back to verse 10, which says nation will rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom, that didn't take place in the 1st century. So again, it's very hard to put together all of these predictions that Jesus is making, because some of them took place, some of them didn't take place. Or if Jesus is speaking about the distant future here, Scripture says that when Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by armies, it's not going to be destroyed. Again, Jesus is saying that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, the end is near. Well, the prophet Zechariah in chapter 12 says that Jerusalem is in the future going to be surrounded. The whole world is going to come up to wage war against Jerusalem, but the prophet says that they're not going to be victorious. God is going to vanquish all those people coming up to make war against Israel, against Jerusalem. In verse 24, Jesus says, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations." Now, he's speaking about what's going to happen to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and really all of Judea, that they're going to fall by the edge of the sword and they'll be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. So again, it's easy for Luke, writing decades after the destruction of Jerusalem, to put these words into the mouth of Jesus. But as we've mentioned before, the sages already forecast the doom of Jerusalem decades before it was destroyed. And again, according to Daniel chapter 9, he already writes about the destruction of Jerusalem around the year 70 of the Common Era. Now, Nachmanides, the famous rabbinic sage I mentioned a few minutes ago, who had the important disputation in Barcelona, so Nachmanides explains that there are two chapters in the 5 books of Moses, two chapters in the Torah that are admonitions where God says, if you don't shape up, if you continue to rebel against him, he's going to punish us severely. So one of these chapters is Leviticus chapter 26, and the other one is Deuteronomy chapter 28. And Nachmanides explains that Leviticus chapter 26 really parallels the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. And he explains that Deuteronomy chapter 28 parallels the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, because Deuteronomy chapter 28 speaks about the idea that Israel, the nation of Israel, is going to be exiled to all corners of the earth. We see that in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 64. And in Leviticus chapter 26, it doesn't speak about a universal exile of the Jewish people. So this idea that, again, in verse 24, where Jesus says that the people in Jerusalem will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, this again is not something that he invented. This is something that already was predicted in the Torah in Deuteronomy chapter 28. There's no real reference, by the way, in the TaNaCh to what Jesus refers to as a time of the Gentiles being fulfilled. Jesus speaks here about all these things happening until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, this is a phrase that comes up in the Christian Bible a few times. Paul mentions it in the book of Romans, but there's nothing in the TaNaCh about this idea of the time of the Gentiles being fulfilled. However, if I had to imagine what it might be in the TaNaCh, can we find a possible reference to this idea of the time of the Gentiles being fulfilled in the TaNaCh, I would guess that it would be the time when the nations of the world, when the Gentile nations of the world admit that the falsehoods of their religions have been uncovered by them, meaning that they will come to a point in their history where they will admit that the false religions that they had been following are false. We see that idea, for example, in Jeremiah chapter 16, verses 19 to 20, where the prophet Jeremiah speaks about the Gentiles coming from all over the world and saying that they inherited only lies and falsehoods and things of no value. And not only will they confess that their religions are false, but they will turn to the Jewish people, the TaNaCh says, for enlightenment. We see this, for example, in Isaiah chapter 60, verses 1 to 3, which speaks about the time when the nations of the world will come to the light of Israel. Isaiah had previously, in the earlier chapters of Isaiah, written about the idea that Israel is to be a light to the nations. And at the end of the book of Isaiah, in chapter 60, he says, one day the nations will come to your light. Or in the book of the prophet Zechariah, chapter 8, verses 22 and 23, speak about a time when, again, the nations of the world will come seeking Hashem, seeking the Almighty, and they're going to come to the Jews and say, we want to follow you because we know that God is with you. So if the TaNaCh has a reference to the time of the Gentiles being fulfilled, I suspect that this is probably what it might refer to. In verse 25, Jesus says there will be signs in the sun and moon and stars, and upon the earth dismay among nations, in perplexity at the roaring of the sea and the waves. Now, many Christian commentaries reference here Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10, and Joel chapter 3, verses 3 to 4, as sources for this idea that there's going to be signs in the sun and the moon and the stars. So the truth is that if you go to Isaiah chapter 13, verse 10, it says, for the stars of the heavens and their constellations will not radiate their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shine forth its light. However, in the TaNaCh, this is not an end-time prophecy, as it makes it very clear at the beginning of this chapter, in chapter 13, verse 1 in Isaiah, it makes it clear that this is a prophecy about the downfall of Babylonia. It's not speaking about the end times. And then if we go to the prophet Joel, again, chapter 3 in Joel, verses 3 to 4, where he says, and I will set signs in the heavens and in earth, blood, fire, and pillars of smoke. The sun shall turn to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the day of the Lord, who is great and awesome. So this is an end-time prophecy of the signs that the Almighty will place in the heavens and on earth to announce the destruction of the enemies of Israel. This is what the passage in Joel is referring to. In verses 26 to 27, Jesus says there'll be men fainting from fear and the expectation of the things which are coming upon the world, and the power of heaven will be shaken, and they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. So every Christian study Bible in the cross-referenced verses, and every Christian commentary to this passage basically references Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. This is what they say is the source for the prediction of Jesus, that the Son of Man will come. They will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. All Christian commentaries and study Bibles reference Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. However, in this chapter, Daniel, we see it, was confused by his vision. He has a very unusual vision of these different powers, different kingdoms, different beasts. And we see in verse 15. So in Daniel chapter 7, verse 15, we're told that Daniel himself was confused and bothered and frightened by the vision that he had. So in verse 16, he asks the angel who was there to explain the meaning of his vision. So again, he has a vision, and as part of that vision, Daniel saw one like a son of man who comes in the clouds before the Ancient of Days. And again, Daniel does not understand this vision. He's bothered by it. So he asks the angel that's there to explain his vision. And in the vision itself, if you go to verse 14, we're told that the one who is like a son of man is given dominion and glory and a kingdom. That's the vision that Daniel has, that this one who is like a son of man will be given dominion and glory and a kingdom. So what does the angel explain to Daniel? The angel explains in 3 verses, and I'm going to go through these with you. In verse 18, in verse 22, and verse 27, the angel explains that the one who is like a son of man is not a person, but is a people. I'll show this to you. It's very clear that the one who is like a son of man is not a person, it's a people. So we see, for example, in verse 18, the angel says that the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever. And then in verse 22, the angel says that the saints of the highest one take possession of the kingdom. And then in verse 27, it says that sovereignty, dominion, and greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. So I understand why Christians get very excited when they read Daniel chapter 7, but the truth is, when we read the explanation, that doesn't happen that often. It's very, very rare. It might be the only place where within the text of the TaNaCh, the text itself is explained. You have on the spot an explanation of a puzzling text. And there it's very, very clear that the one who is like a son of man is not a person, it is a people. It's the nation of Israel, God's holy ones. And then in verses 28 to 32, Jesus already speaks about his so-called second coming. But when these things begin to take place, Jesus says, straighten up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. And he told them a parable. Behold, the fig tree and all the trees, as soon as they put forth their leaves, see it and know for yourselves that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happening, meaning all the things that he's been describing in this chapter, recognize that the kingdom of God is near. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all things take place. You find the same passage, by the way, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34. Now, from here, from this last little piece, it seems that the expectation was that the second coming was expected to be imminent. It was expected to be imminent. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 28, Jesus says, truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who shall not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So Jesus is with his disciples, and he says, there are some of you who are standing here now who will not taste death until you see the Son of Man, is how Jesus referred to himself, coming in his kingdom, meaning the fulfillment of the kingdom is going to take place within the lifetime of the disciples of Jesus. And we see this expectation literally throughout the Christian Bible. Romans 16, chapter 20, Paul says, and the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. When is the Christian expectation of Satan being destroyed going to happen? It didn't happen in the lifetime of Jesus. It's an expectation for what Jesus will do when he returns. So Paul says in Romans 16 that Satan is going to soon be crushed. Well, that means that when Paul wrote this, he's assuming that in his days, Jesus is going to return. Or we see the same kind of prediction in the book of Revelation, chapter 22, verses 7 and 12 and 20, where Jesus says, I am coming quickly, meaning it's not saying I'm going to come after a long period of time. I'm coming quickly. Or James chapter 5, verse 8, which says, the coming of the Lord is at hand. It's at hand. When you speak about something being at hand, it means it's around the corner. It doesn't mean it's hundreds or thousands of years away. Or 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. Children, he says, it is the last hour. Well, the last hour means there's no other hours after that, meaning that they're now in the last days. And the truth is that even in the first century, there was tremendous frustration among the followers of Jesus that he had not returned. The first book in the Christian Bible that was written is 1 Thessalonians. And one of the issues that Paul deals with in 1 Thessalonians, which most people think is written around the year 50. Now, when Jesus speaks about this generation not passing away till everything be fulfilled, well, generation is approximately 20 years. If Jesus is killed around the year 30, well, a generation is up around the year 50. And it's around this time, around the year 50, that the disciples of Jesus are wondering, so what's going on? Where is he? Where is he? Where is he? And it's this tremendous frustration at the failure of Jesus to return, at this unfortunate delay in the second coming, that leads Paul to address this very question in the book of Thessalonians, because again, that was the expectation. Now, in TaNaCh, in the Hebrew scriptures, Mashiach does not come with an installment plan. In the TaNaCh, there's no second coming of the Mashiach. He comes and he fulfills his mission, and there's no coming and failing, or coming and dying and coming back thousands of years later. That's simply not in the TaNaCh. It's not there. And the truth is that this idea of the Messiah having to die or fail and come back later, this is a claim that could be made for any failed or false Messiah. Anyone that claims to be the Messiah and fails to fulfill what the Messiah is supposed to do, the followers can always say, well, but he'll come back and finish the job, or he'll come back and do the job. You could say that about anyone. And so it's not really a strong argument, because it's really sort of what we call the fudge factor, that any false Messiah can justify their failure by claiming that they'll come back and finish the job or fulfill the mission. Okay, so that's a very quick and superficial look at this chapter. Really, we could go on for hours going into this chapter in a very deep way, but time only allows us to do it sort of on this level, and that'll have to be it until we go back and do a Rabbi Cross-Examines Christianity and the New Testament 2.0.
Yes.
Which will be in another 2 years.
There you go. There you go. But I think we do have some other stuff lined up for you. As far as maybe, we still haven't decided yet, like the prophets or something like that. So
no, we haven't decided.
We haven't decided.
I was just making a joke. I'm not going to go back and do all this again.
No, that was very, very, I could say torturous. Not really. Not really. I really appreciate it. I know we all do, for sure. Glad you were able to do it for us. So you should all have a wonderful week. Rabbi, you should have a blessed week and get plenty of rest that you need. And we'll look forward to seeing you same time, same place next week.
Thanks so much. Have a great week. God bless you.
Shalom. Take care, Rabbi.
If you enjoy this channel and the content, and it has changed your life, or perhaps the life of a loved one or a close friend, would you please consider supporting this work? You can click this link and it'll take you directly to my website with the donate button. Or there's a Patreon link and a mailing address for snail mail if you would prefer. If you do donate, please do me a favor and leave me a phone number where I can contact you and thank you properly. I hope you all have a wonderful 2025. Shalom.